handle those differences. How we handle differences like that, how we divide up the pie, ends up having an enormous impact on our relationship and how we conduct the negotiation. This is the crunch in a negotiation. Usually what happens all too often is people resolve differences on the basis of will and power. Who's stronger? Who's going to dig in more? Who's going to assert themselves more? Who's going to threaten more? And the costs of a contest of will like that can be enormous. Because what happens is the issue, the problem that you're trying to resolve, goes off the table. And what's on the table then is people's egos. And the question is, whose ego is going to win? People forget about interests. They're just focused on their positions. They're not inventing at all. And the real cost is one side or the other has to give in. And you won't like to give in if it's you, and they won't like to give in if it's them. And even if you are successful in making them give in, they're going to remember it. And they're going to think about getting their revenge next time. So if the costs of a contest of will are so large, what's the alternative? The alternative, what you see successful negotiators use, is they try to decide opposed interests on the basis not of a contest of will, but on the basis of objective criteria. Objective criteria like, what's the market rate for the product? What are other people who are doing the same job, what are they paid? What about scientific judgment? What about reciprocity or equal treatment? All of those are like measuring sticks, ways in which we can measure what is fair, what's a fair way to divide up the pie. So neither side has to give in. Both sides can defer to what is fair. Let me give you an example. Two friends of mine who head up two large companies in their industry. Both are very dynamic, ambitious business leaders. And they both realized that if they merged their two companies, they could make a giant in their industry. The potential synergies were enormous. But such mergers often run into the problems of personalities, egos, both individual and organizational. And in this case, the question was, which leader was going to run the new combined company? Who was going to be the CEO? And where was the company headquarters going to be located? Was it going to be located on the west coast of the United States where one company was, or was it going to be located on the east coast? Now, these kinds of issues often break up mergers. And if the two leaders had decided to settle this on the basis of a contest of will, where each side threatened to pull out of the deal, there probably would have been no merger. And even if there had been an agreement, what kind of way is that to begin a corporate marriage? Instead, what these two business leaders did was they decided to resolve these issues on the basis of objective standards, on the basis of what was fair. So they looked at the question of who should be CEO. They looked at the qualifications of each. Both were equally qualified. But one was older than the other. One had more seniority in the industry than the other. And so they jointly decided that the leader who was older would become the CEO for a couple of years until he reached retirement age. And after that point, the other man would become the CEO of the company. The question of the company headquarters, they decided both headquarters were very beautiful and could well have suited the purpose. But they decided to settle on the basis of which headquarters was closer to the customer base. In this case, the number one customer of both companies, they were aerospace companies, was the U.S. federal government. So they decided that the company that was close to Washington, D.C. on the East Coast, that's where the headquarters ought to be. Well, the merger went through, and it became a spectacularly successful merger, thanks in no small part to the fairness with which the negotiation was conducted. So with objective criteria, neither side has to give in. Both sides defer to what's fair. It's much easier for the other side to defer to an objective criterion like market rate than it is for them to give into your position. And think about what they have to say when they go back to their people, to their boss, to their peers, and they have to explain why they decided to accept your proposal. It's much easier if they have some persuasive objective criteria to point to, like that's the way we did it before, that's the way others are doing it the same way, than it is for them to say, well, that's the most that they would give. Objective criteria not only build a better relationship, but they provide a better outcome. Now we come to the third phase of a negotiation, the phase of making proposals and trying to reach agreement. This brings up the question of power negotiation. What is power? Power negotiation is the ability to satisfy your interests. It's the ability to get what you want. And if you think about it in these terms, then every one of the principles that we've discussed thus far actually enhances your power. To the extent that you're able to go to the balcony and keep your eyes on what are your interests, you're more likely to satisfy your interests. That's the power of perspective. To the extent that you're able to step to the other person's side, listen to them, acknowledge them, we all know people who are good at doing that, and they're better able to get what they need or want from that person. That's the power of diplomacy. Then there's the power of focusing on interests, really understanding what are the other side's interests. That's the power of good intelligence, and it definitely enhances your ability to get a good agreement. Then there's the power of inventing options for mutual gain. That's the power of creativity, to come up with ideas that you might not have thought of before. Then there's the power of focusing on objective criteria, the power of persuasion, the power of legitimacy. And finally, there is a sixth source of power, which may be the most important, which is the power in a negotiation of having a good alternative. In other words, having a good course of action to follow to meet your interests if for some reason you're not able to reach agreement. Your best alternative is what are you going to do if you are not able to reach agreement with that particular person. Consider an example. A sales team that I know was working on a project for 6 months. They thought that they had the project all agreed upon. They were having one final meeting with the client, at which time the client said, look, I love the whole proposal, we love the project, we want to go ahead, but I'm afraid you're going to have to cut the price by 15%. Well, the sales team panicked. Their whole year's commission was dependent on this one project. They didn't think they could do anything else, so in that flash, they could see their whole life flash before their eyes, and in the end, they gave the customer a 10% discount. Now, that 10% discount turned out to be the entire profit margin on the project, all gone in 1 second. Now, think about what happened. The sales team thought, they hadn't thought through what were they going to do if they could not reach agreement with this particular customer. They didn't know what their alternative was. And even if they had thought it through, they thought they didn't have an alternative. But is this true? Is it really true that they didn't have an alternative? Consider a story of a Zen student who was drinking a cup of tea. And as he lifted the cup of tea to his lips, a Zen master came by with a big stick and said to him, if you drink that cup of tea, I'm going to hit you with a stick. And if you don't drink this cup of tea, I'm going to hit you with this stick. Now, if you were the Zen student, what would you do? Most of us think, well, if I'm going to be hit, I might as well drink the cup of tea and enjoy it. Or we think, okay, I'm not going to accept that. I'm going to fight back with the Zen master. Those are the two normal alternatives that we think of when we're confronted by superior power, which is either to submit to it because we have no choice or to fight back. But in fact, there are other alternatives. The Zen student, for example, could walk away, could exit the situation. Or the Zen student could, for example, take the stick away from the Zen master. He's not getting into a fight with the Zen master, he's just removing the Zen master's ability to hit him. Or the student might appeal to help to other students to see if they could be of assistance. So there are other alternatives in that situation, just as there were other alternatives in the situation of the sales team. The sales team, when confronted with the client who demanded a 15% discount, might have said, okay, we can't do business with this particular person in this company. Maybe there's someone else in the company whom we can talk to see if we can reach an agreement. Or perhaps they could have gone back to their boss and asked their boss to call the other person's boss in that company, in the customer, to see if they could reach a deal. Or perhaps they could say, wait a minute, maybe there are other customers who want the same kind of work, and we can use the time and the effort that we put into this project, we can deploy it for another customer. So there are other alternatives in life. So one of the keys in negotiation, before you get into any negotiation, one of the most important things you need to do is to always think through, what is my best alternative? What am I going to do if I'm not able to reach agreement with the other side? Is there any way that I can improve or develop that alternative to make it more satisfactory to me? And it's also useful to estimate the other side's alternative. What are they going to do if they're not able to reach agreement with you? What would the customer do in that particular situation? Because sometimes we think the customer is all powerful, but think about it. The customer has invested 6 months of time and effort in that particular project. It might put their plans into disarray if they were to try to go to another supplier. So knowing your best alternative, improving your best alternative, and estimating theirs is an effective way to pursue your interests and to balance the power with a seemingly more powerful negotiator. So you've engaged in problem solving, and you've now balanced the power. And you think that you have invented an option that meets your interests and meets theirs better than their alternative does. So you're probably on your way to an agreement. But what if they still say no? What if the more you push for your idea, the more they push back? What do you do in that situation? How do you close the negotiation? Think about it this way for a moment. You're over here. This is where you want them to be. This is your position. They're over here. This is where they are. And when you're over here, what you're saying to them is, come over to my position. Come over to where I want you to be. But that may not be so easy for them. If you put yourself in their shoes for a moment, it's not so easy for them to go over to where you want them to be, because it's like there's a big chasm, like the Grand Canyon, filled with anxiety, dissatisfaction, unmet needs. It's not so easy for them to go to where you want them to be. What this requires is for you for a moment to leave where your thinking is, and that's not easy, and for a moment to go and start where their thinking is. Start from their position and build them a golden bridge over that chasm of their dissatisfaction. Make it as attractive as possible for them to say yes. Make that bridge as golden as you possibly can. Let me give you an example. There was once a negotiation between a large multinational company and the owner of perhaps the most successful steakhouse in the United States. The company was interested in purchasing this steakhouse and turning it into a chain. Well, I had a conversation with the acquisitions negotiator, and he told me about how difficult this negotiation was, because he sat down with the owner of the steakhouse, and the more they talked, and the company made a very generous offer, and he said he wanted more, and the conversation went on for weeks and months, and finally the acquisitions negotiator was about to throw up his hands and go home. There was no use. Couldn't negotiate with the owner. Couldn't satisfy him. Just before he left, though, he thought, maybe there's something I've forgotten. Maybe there's something I've left out. Because what we tend to do in negotiation is we often think it's just a question of money. The acquisitions negotiator asked himself, what have I left out? What have I missed out on? He went back and talked to the owner of the steakhouse.